welcome to podcast episode number 27 of the ISPC Tailboard Talks podcast. I'm your host, Mark. Along with me today is our special guest, Mr. Jim Vaughn, which I'll get to in a moment. This is also episode number 5 of our 5-part series on EPZ and field safety with Jim. Again, there was 4 episodes prior to this one. We would highly recommend at a minimum you go listen to the first episode, which was number 23, which dealt with the laws and principles of EPZ. And then each session after that built on those laws and principles. So we've talked about distribution and URD. We've talked about transmission and induction. We've talked about substation. And last but not least today, we are going to talk about grounding of trucks and step potential protection. You know, I've been highlighting this in some of the grounding and bonding sessions I've done in the past here, and this is always a hot topic. You know, what do we do when it comes to the trucks, right? And so I think you'll get some good information today from this podcast and Jim. Again, if you have questions, you can email podcast@ispconline.com. Again, in some earlier episodes, I also gave my email address out, mark@ispconline.com. Either one will get your questions to us, and we'll get them answered for you. Again, today's episode, grounding trucks and step potential protection. And so we'll jump into that in a minute here.
This podcast is sponsored by IP Institute. Develop your utility frontline leaders today at ip-institute.com.
So let's introduce our guest today. Again, Jim Vaughn, Senior Consultant for the Institute for Safety and Powerline Construction and an industry expert in grounding and bonding, among others as well. Jim, great to have you with us again today. How you doing?
Good, Mark, and thank you for making the podcast available. We'd like the opportunity to touch so many people. I want to encourage you to share the access to the podcast for everybody to get into it for a couple of good reasons. One of them is that we're actually covering our whole day-long presentation that we do with our clients.
Yep.
And in this case, it's free.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why we wanted to do this is because we still are seeing people get hurt. They shouldn't be. We're offering this opportunity to get this information out, and like Mark said, if it raises a question, because I'm really focusing on trying to talk about the practical things that we need to do, not covering all necessarily of all of the principles and the standards that apply, because I want this to make sense as we're doing it. So do contact us if you need more information.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jim. And obviously it might be difficult to put all 5 episodes together and make a one-day grounding training. And a lot of that, I have people, I just did my presentation out of the IP conference the other week in Charleston. And, a lot of what we provide, and I know you do the same, Jim, is you'll see the slides on the screen, but a lot of the information comes from our experiences and our exposure over our careers, right? And things we've dealt with. And, I know you get a lot of it when it comes to incident investigations and so on, and a lot of that knowledge, or a lot of that, what comes out of those presentations as well, which we don't have in the podcast format, is that interaction with the folks that you're giving the training to, right? And so,
right.
Essentially, like Jim said, what you're getting out of this podcast is what is in our presentations that we come out and deliver to customers. But a very, very important part of that is the interaction with the crews, because to your point, Jim, people are still getting hurt. And I always say this, it simply amazes me, and it probably shouldn't, how many times we go out and do our presentations around grounding and bonding, and the amount of people that we run into that, I don't want to say they don't get it. I want to say they don't or maybe haven't been exposed or been to, had the opportunity to be exposed to some of these things, right? And so sometimes I think and maybe hope that some of it is they don't know what they don't know, right? And I think we kind of see it in a different light because we deal with it so much. But I think, I know coming from a utility, you kind of get in that silo, right? Where it's just the way we do it here. And nobody has ever brought other concerns or protections to light. And so until you go hear somebody like yourself or me or anybody else for that matter that's doing grounding and bonding training and gets people to look at things a different way, or think about things a different way, that's often when the light bulbs start going off. So,
You make a really good point there that I want to address. And you talking about coming from utility, and you spent your whole career, at the same utility. Now, personally, I couldn't keep a job, and so I've worked for about 8 different utilities and 4 or 5 different contractors. But then I've been doing it for 52 years, and so that's pretty easy to be in a lot of places. But I never had a problem. I knew I was qualified. I could get a job, and I didn't mind dragging up if I wasn't comfortable, just going someplace else. But you make
sure.
a really good point because, ISPC played a fairly significant role in the evolution of Incident Prevention's CUSP program.
Mm-hmm.
When I say pretty significant role, I wrote all the exams for the
Yep.
first 4 years until we continued to expand it. And we put a committee together, and then the committee took over the exams. But one of the things that you do when you write tests, there's a it's actually scientific. It's called psychometrics, and because I was teaching as an adjunct professor of electrical distribution technology, I had to University of or the Florida university system required that I take psychometrics training, which is the art and science of conducting tests. Well, one of the things that you do when you are writing and conducting tests is that you analyze and evaluate the outcomes to determine how effective your testing is. Because testing plays 2 roles. It's the last opportunity to remind the candidate of certain aspects of the training that they have had, and then the other one is to evaluate their competency in the particular arena that you're testing on. And so when we did the first of the evaluations, we now had in the first evaluations we had over 500 people that had taken the CUSP exam. We found out that people from the same utilities or the same contractors, and all of these people were competent safety people, they all missed the same questions. Now, it's not because they were cheating, it's because they grew up in this tunnel where information was passed down to them that came from a shaky foundation, and they had no one to tell them that it wasn't right. See, up until 1974, when OSHA came out, we didn't really have a clearinghouse for information like OSHA was that was telling us how people were getting hurt. We had the IEEE, but they were just talking about engineering details and how do you build a substation that doesn't blow up, or how do you build a feeder, or how do you build a transmission circuit that is effective and stays connected. Nobody was looking at how people were getting hurt and how to protect them until OSHA was exchanging that information. And so the industry did a really lousy job of passing on that information, and some of that information was so corrupt that it sounded right, and people just learned to live with it, thinking that they were right, until we started to show them the principles that applied, and which is the reason why when we talk about the CUSP, they said, "Hey, here's some things you need to read." They are things that people never looked at before, like the consensus standards. Here you have 40 pages of best practices put together by some of the smartest people in the industry, and not just all from some company. They're from 40 or 50 different companies, and they bring with them all that information, and they create this consensus standard or agreement about how we should be performing this work. And so we required that when you take that test, here's all the information that you need to look at before you take this test in order that you get it right. And over the years that I was heavily involved with the CUSP, I would get phone calls daily of people that were studying up, and they were saying, "Hey, I just looked at substation 80 or the 524 standard on grounding. I had no idea." And they're correcting misinformation that they've been getting. So that's the reason why we're approaching uh, these presentations that we're doing from a practical perspective, trying to tell you why it is that we do what we do.
Yeah.
So that what you just said about coming from the utility and having that tunnel vision, that's very, very valuable that everybody understand that, because
Yeah.
when they hear something, I want them to go look it up and see if I'm right.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And so seek out the information. It's there. Hopefully, we'll provide a lot of it here for you today, as well as we did with the other episodes. And again, speaking of the standards, this is everything we've been talking about for the last 4 episodes, and we'll continue to talk about with today's episode is around 1910-269 N3, which is the equipotential zone, where OSHA tells us that our temporary protective grounds should be placed in such locations and arranged in such a manner that the employer can demonstrate will prevent each employee from being exposed to hazardous differences in electrical potential. And then comes the $1 million question, Jim, and that is, okay, do we ground vehicles or don't we ground vehicles, right? I know you and I have had many conversations on this over the past number of years, and I've had conversations and arguments with safety professionals and everyone alike about, grounding vehicles or grounding equipment. Let's even just go to equipment, right? Trucks, vehicles, you name it. Again, we kind of asked the first question, what does OSHA say about grounding vehicles? And we can touch on that. And I think more importantly, and we'll probably build on this throughout the episode, but, we definitely want to answer that question. Do we ground them or don't we ground them, right? And so I'll let you, I know you got a big grin on your face that nobody else can see but me, but I know you're chomping at the bit to go down this one.
Yeah, because this one always this one always surprises people.
Yeah.
And so and some of it is because of that long-term experience. You work for an employer, and the employer says we always ground our trucks. That's the first thing we do when we pull up on the job site, and that's the employer's rule, and that's what you're supposed to do. You are the employee. The employer is ultimately responsible for the safety steps and practices that are employed in the field, and you must do what they say. Okay.
Yep.
Now, we're going to be talking about the practical applications and the standard. And when I say the standard, I'm talking about OSHA, of course. And I want to tell you, too, everything that I tell you during this podcast, some of it might surprise you, but we're not going to tell you, and we don't tell you anything in this podcast that cannot be directly traceable right back to either consensus standards or an OSHA standard. And I'm going to explain the OSHA standard in this way. There is nothing in the OSHA standard that says that you must ground trucks all the time. The standard, the single applicable standard, is found in OSHA 1910-269, and the standard number is P43C. And it says each employee shall be protected from the hazards that might arise from equipment contact. And what they're talking about is sticking a boom up in the face, transmission, distribution, doesn't matter, secondary, doesn't matter. And then it says, unless the employer can demonstrate that the methods in use protect each employee, The measures used shall include all of the following techniques. Okay, so I can preface all of the following techniques, if you haven't read this before, by saying, what would happen if I was touching the truck, standing on bare ground in tennis shoes, and the boom operator stuck the boom into 23 kV distribution? And everybody who listens to this podcast is going to say, well, they would be seriously injured or probably killed. And that's true. So the OSHA rule P4 3C says each employee shall be protected from hazards. So touching the truck when the truck becomes energized, that's a hazard that could result in fatality. And then it says the methods used, the measures used, shall include all of the following techniques. And I'll guarantee you that the majority of the people who listen to this podcast do not do all four of these things. Number one, using the best available ground to minimize the time the lines remain energized. Okay, what's the purpose of grounding? Trip the circuit. All right. Number one, use the best available ground to minimize the time the lines remain energized. Now, when it comes to protecting workers, grounding doesn't protect the worker. What protects the worker? Bonding. Rule number two says bonding equipment together to minimize potential differences. So if I have a digger derrick truck or two bucket trucks backed up, practically bumper to bumper, and I'm standing in between them, and one truck gets in the phase and the other truck is grounded, and I'm standing between the two, there's going to be a potential difference between them that could result in a serious injury or a fatality. So number two is bonding equipment together. Number three is providing equipment mats to extend areas of equipotential, which means that if you are touching the truck or have to touch the truck, then equipment mats are to be placed so that you would be standing on a mat that's bonded to the truck so that your hands and feet would be at the same potential. You would not be exposed to a hazardous potential. You would not be killed. And then the last one is employing insulated protective equipment or barricades to guard against any remaining hazardous potential differences. So now that we've talked about all four of those required things, let me go back to the beginning of the rule. Each employee shall be protected from the hazards that might arise from equipment contact. The second part of that rule says, unless the employer can demonstrate that the methods in use protect each employee, the methods used shall include grounding, bonding, matting, and barricading. So, do we have to do all four of those things? No. Listen to what the rule says. Unless the employer can demonstrate that the methods in use protect each employee. It doesn't say the grounding in use, it says the methods in use. So let me tell you a little story that actually applies to three different OSHA cases. Now, you know the ISPC, we work with employers to build defense strategies in OSHA actions and in civil actions, and sometimes we are on the plaintiff side of the case. I handle all the litigations, and I've been doing both OSHA and civil litigations in the electrical utility industry for more than 20 years. So I have a lot of cases that I can always go back to show you how the law, was applied. On three occasions, I have worked with lawyers to defend an employer all the way up to the federal it's actually known as it's the final decision in an OSHA contest. So if OSHA comes up, cites me for something, I can contest it. It's contested first to the local board, and then it might be contested to a local hearing. And if you still want to contest, then you go up to the federal level in Washington, where you go before a judge and everybody argues their case, and the judge determines what the case or what the OSHA rule says. We have been successful every time defending an employer following this rule that I just read to you, because it actually is the only rule. And each time OSHA cited an employer for not grounding trucks, but in each case, nobody on the ground had been injured. In each one of the cases, a worker in the air had received a lethal electrical contact. And in the course of investigating the incident, reading their understanding of the rules, they noticed that the trucks weren't grounded, and they cited the employer for failing to ground the trucks. And then they cited them for an exposure for each employee that was on the ground. So sometimes they were fining them $7,200 for each person that was on the ground. And sometimes in one case, there was 15 people that were on the ground because it was at a breakover and on a pulling a wire stringing job. And we were successful each time because the rule doesn't say grounding, it says methods in use. So what is method in use? Let's go back to the very first thing when I started the introduction to this portion. I said, if you're standing next to the truck and you touching the truck and the truck becomes energized, you're going to get seriously injured and maybe probably even killed. So if touching the truck will get you killed, how do you prevent that? Drum roll. Don't touch the truck. Now that sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? But is it effective? Absolutely. If you're not touching the truck, you can't be electrocuted. So not touching the truck, that goes down to that fourth one, which it says using protective equipment or barricades. So if I pull my truck up and I'm going to have booms in the air, two things. If I have insulated booms, like my top boom is insulated, my lower boom has a chassis protection insert in it. Even if I stick the elbow into the distribution, no current or voltage is going to come down that boom because of the what's called the chassis isolation, or some people call it the Johnny ball, or that fiberglass section that's in there. That truck's not going to become energized. So that is a method of protecting the workers. Positioning the truck so that the elbow can never become or get into energized conductor. That is also a method. Pre-planning my work so that nobody has to go to the truck during the operation, so that nobody will be sticking their hands in a bin when the booms are up in the air or when the digger derrick's up in the air. Nobody's going to be touching the truck. All of these are methods of limiting the exposure of the workers so that nobody can get hurt, and they're all legitimate. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to go to your employer and say, we don't have to ground our trucks anymore, okay? What I'm doing is explaining to you the appropriate, proper, defensible interpretation of what the OSHA standard is. The very first part of the standard says protecting employees from hazards that might arise from equipment contact. So if I've got fiberglass booms and there's no possibility that no part of the conductive part of the boom can come in contact with the bus, I don't need to ground the truck. It doesn't serve any purpose to do that. Now, there still are employers that say ground the truck, and that's okay. That's fine. But what are we accomplishing when we ground the truck? So think about it in these practical terms. If a helper came onto the job for the very first day on your job, would you allow that helper to go up in the bucket truck and put bare hands on the system neutral? The answer is absolutely not. He's not qualified. But if I ground a truck to a pole bond and the pole bond is connected to the system neutral, What's the difference? Would I allow that helper to touch the truck? It's exactly the same thing. So grounding a truck to a system pole bond connected to a system neutral, even though we have studies that say that a system neutral connection for grounding of a truck is the very best for the purpose of tripping the circuit should the truck get in the bus, they're absolutely right. But that doesn't answer all of the questions, because what does the rule say? The rules say, unless the employer can demonstrate that the methods in use protect each employee. Well, if I ground the truck to a pole bond connected to a system neutral, then my truck is exactly the same thing as a system neutral. The outrigger's sitting on wood pads or plastic pads. It's sitting on rubber tires. So the truck itself is a floating neutral conductor waiting for somebody to walk up to it and touch it and complete the pathway to ground. So for that reason, even though the rule agrees that the system neutral or a static on a pole, multi-grounded static, is the very best grounds to use, that answers number one, using the best available ground. But see, it's not by itself. Remember what the rule says? All four rules must be, four elements of the rule must be followed, using the best available ground. But then what does rule number 3 say? Provide ground mats to extend areas of equipotential. Why? Because grounding the truck does not put the truck at equipotential to the earth. Grounding the truck actually ties the truck to the system neutral, which is a system component of fault management in the electrical system. So I had a case one time where I was doing the investigation for the utility that I work for. We had an apprentice that was grounding the truck, and he'd stuck his clines under the pole bond to punch it out so he could get the truck ground under it. And while he had his clines under the pole bond, he received an electrical shock, and it knocked the wind out of him. It knocked him down. We took him to the hospital, check him out, make sure that he was going to be okay. He said he got shocked on the pole bond. Everybody said, it's not possible that could happen. And it's very, very unusual that it would. But it was a Georgia day, rained the night before. The grass was a foot high and wet. He'd walked through it. There's a little drainage on the side of the road that he'd stepped in. His boots were wet. And when he touched the pole bond, had his clines under there, that pole bond became energized by virtue of some source, and he received a shock. At first, everybody thought it was a funny bone thing that he whacked his elbow, and that was a fake thing, but it knocked the wind out of him, and so we knew that he'd received an electrical shock, and he did. Well, it turned out we couldn't hear it through the Georgia pines, but only just not too many spans away, after our apprentice was knocked down, the trouble office called the crew and said, "Hey, you guys okay?" They had one shot on the feeder. He said, "We just lost the feeder that you're working on. Could you ride it out and see what's going on? We'd like to get it back." And they took off, and they were riding the circuit out. And they came down a number of spans, and they found what was obviously a slack span that had gotten together. And what they found out was that it was in the corner of a gas station that had two dead ends connected together, turning a corner by a slack span.
Attention all utility professionals. Are you ready to transform your safety leadership culture? Introducing IP Institute's Frontline Leadership Program, a comprehensive training program that will elevate safety throughout every level of your organization. Led by one of the industry's premier leading minds, David McPeak, this program offers in-depth modules on leadership, human performance, and incident prevention. Frontline delivers key safety problem-solving skills, either in person, in an engaging, interactive classroom session, or learners can become safety superstars through our convenient video-driven online course. Don't miss your opportunity to take your organization's safety culture to the next level. Go to ip-institute.com and join the thousands who have built a powerful, sustainable safety culture with Frontline.
So what happened was that somebody in that gas station parking lot had hooked the down guy, twanged the down guy, shook the slack span together, and with the neutral, and had a three-phase to neutral flash that went down the circuit at the same precise moment that the apprentice had the pole bond exposed and had his hands underneath it, and he got a brunt of the divided fault current that was hitting all the pole bonds coming off the system neutral. So you see that connecting a truck to a system neutral puts it in that system. So when I say you're connecting it to a member of the system of protection for the feeder, which is the system neutral. So you have to have the ground mats out there around the truck. That's what the OSHA rule says. And then employing insulated protective equipment, which could be rubber gloves, it could be rubber boots, it could be shielding or rubber goods that we put up in the on the bus in order to prevent a direct contact from the boom. And then it says, or barricades to guard against any remaining hazardous potential differences. So simply grounding the truck is not considered protection for the worker because of the rule requirement that if you ground the truck, you still can't prove that employee is protected. You must do these other things. Now, you can build an argument that says, well, we're going to ground all the trucks, but before we ground the trucks, we're going to get all the equipment and all the material off that we need. And we're nobody's going to come back to that truck. And if we do need a 20-inch DA bolt that we didn't plan on, we're going to back out away from the bus. Nobody's going to be there. And then we're going to say, go to the truck, get your stuff, and then get it on the hand line, and we'll go back to work. That's a procedure. It's another way of protecting the worker because it isolates that truck to a degree of relative certainty that nobody is going to get hurt. So that's the thing about the barricades. But if I just put up the barricades, I've accomplished the exact same thing. Whether the truck is grounded or not, the barricades protect the worker because the worker does not approach the truck close enough to put themselves at risk, and they certainly don't touch the truck while the booms are up in the air. So that's a practical and defensible interpretation of the OSHA standard that requires protection of the worker from contact with an energized source that would energize the truck and create a level of risk. How many questions does that raise, Mark? What do you think?
Yeah, for sure. A ton of them. Because I've argued. I shouldn't say argued. I've had conversations with safety professionals about that same thing, right? That kind of make the blanket statement, we're grounding all vehicles, right? And then having that false sense of protection just because the vehicle is grounded.
And here's a reminder here that we've done in each one of the podcasts. Grounding is to trip a circuit. Yep. Bonding protects the worker. So right away, that should be the only argument that you need when it comes to the question about grounding trucks. And that because when somebody says, well, we ground all of our trucks, when we're doing an audit or helping them develop their program, the very first question we ask is for what purpose? And they'll say, well, OSHA standard requires it. And they say, no, it doesn't. Take a look at this. And we show them P43C. And we go through the same discussion that we just had here, on the podcast. The OSHA standard doesn't require grounding the trucks. The OSHA standard requires protection of the worker. And wherever you see an OSHA requirement that says grounding is required, it is always either preceded by or followed by the requirement to bond the employee in. And what do you see here? Rule or requirement number 1, using the best available ground. Requirement number 3, ground mats to extend areas of equipotential.
Mhm.
So the requirement to ground is followed by the requirement to create an equipotential zone for that worker, and then barricades in order to limit approach, and bonding equipment together for anybody that has to be between those two pieces of equipment. Because I use the example of backing two trucks up, tail to tail. If I put out an equipotential mat for both of them, they're still going to be at a difference in potential. So I have to bond them together to make sure that somebody standing on an equipotential mat touching either one of the trucks is not going to be exposed. Now, the likelihood of this occurring is not very, it's not very likely that it's going to occur. And that's a problem for us because we haven't been taking precautions. So when I explain, especially when I'm going to talk about step potential in a minute, people think, well, you don't think there's a risk. Well, I've been doing this for 52 years, and there has never been a fatality from step potential. Now, everybody will say, oh, I heard of this and I heard of that. And we say, well, we really want to know about it. I just had a guy call me 2 weeks ago and said, hey, did you hear about the child that was electrocuted when the crew dropped a number 6 primary on a truck and the little girl was standing near the truck? And I said, oh, that's horrible. But they said, see, but it's an example of step potential. And I spent 2 days trying to track it down. I even called the local news agency and said, I'm trying to track down a story about somebody from your city during storm restoration. And they said, nope, we'll look into it. And they called me back. Never happened. Somebody had the idea, that it did. Now, here's why. It boils down to this. The reality of step potential is absolutely true.
Mhm.
But what is it that is the hazard in electrical contact? Is it current or is it potential or voltage? Everybody listening is going to say, oh, it's current. Exactly. Voltage without current will not kill you. As we always say, it'll make you wish you hadn't done it sometimes and you won't ever do it again, but it won't kill you. This is one of my favorite things about capacitors. I've been, and again, it has to do with auditing, companies. I actually was at a company where a guy got 4 days off because he delivered a capacitor to the storeroom and he didn't shunt the bushings on a 2 bushing capacitor, and it was a rule, and that's absolutely true. And they should, if the rules aren't followed, they should hold people accountable. But they gave this guy 4 days off, and they said somebody could have been killed, and I said, uh, uh-uh. You can't be killed by the charge on a capacitor. There's no current involved.
Mhm.
It's a voltage discharge that equalizes across your body. Now, again, with electricity, there's no absolutes. If you're like me, 72 years old, and you're over there barefoot, you touch a capacitor, and that discharge, interrupts, your old heart, or something like that. You can't say, well, nobody. I mean, not everybody is absolute. It certainly
Mhm.
could happen, but it hasn't. Now,
Right.
people have touched capacitors, got electrocuted, but they were up on a pole with a working capacitor. Nobody's ever been killed by a capacitor that discharged sitting on the back of a truck.
Right.
It's only voltage, there's no current. So, what do we call the hazard around a truck if the truck should be energized? We call it the hazard of step potential. In other words, a potential difference between my right foot and my left foot to such a degree that voltage would shock me and current in the ground could flow through my body. What's missing from that scenario? Current cannot flow horizontally without a path. And if it does flow horizontally, it has to develop enough voltage in that step between your right and left foot in order to penetrate your skin. Now, it has happened, and I have two cases right now where people were shocked, and now they want to, they're filing a suit, and they wanted to call OSHA, and OSHA came in. Neither one of them was killed, and only one person was shocked, and they were the same distance from every other person that was the same distance from the truck when the digger derrick got into a 69 kV line, and they received a shock. And OSHA came out and they did an investigation. They cited the employer, and they should have. The employer had none of the protections up. There was no barricades up. The worker was standing about 3 feet away from the truck, and he received a shock. But he wasn't electrocuted, and he didn't get killed because there was no current component. Now, there was a comment in the substation standard when they were talking about using switching platforms and walking grates inside of a substation. The question came up among the committee as to whether or not those grates had to be bonded and whether or not there was a shock hazard that was involved. And the commentary actually said, well, a shock hazard would not be deadly. The likelihood of current flowing horizontally through the rock bed in a substation is so unlikely, it's not going to be addressed here. Well, when OSHA came out and said, yeah, but there's no absolutes. So they removed that from the, from the substation standard 80. They removed that comment because they said, yeah, well, we don't want to open up any worms here that we can't say absolutely won't occur. Mm-hmm. So now let me go back 25 years ago to my very first fatality case that I was hired as an expert on. It was a case of an 8-year-old boy that was electrocuted on an underground ball field lighting system. And he was some 15 feet away from the pole that had lights on it. It was a 480 volt, 277 480 volt lighting system on a 480 volt three-phase circuit. And he was, it had rained that night. He'd taken off the sandals that he was wearing because they were wet and slippery, and he was running across the field to get to the dugout where his parents were. And he suddenly stopped, and he was electrocuted, and he did not survive the contact. So I was working on behalf of the utilities, who were one of 5 different groups and entities that were sued, over this horrible death of this 8-year-old boy. So what we do, we started tracking everything out. And one of the things, and we actually used the utilities locating system to trace the underground cables that were all in steel conduit, to trace the cable pathways, because there's only a couple of different ways that you can get electrocuted, and one of them has to have a current available to create the electrical hazard. So the guy was tracing it out, and as he was walking towards that pole, he made a right turn where a right turn didn't belong, and then a left turn, and a left turn, and a left turn. And we realized what he was doing was he was outlining a junction box that was buried in the ground, and it turned out to have a steel lid. The steel lid was in contact with a 350 MCM split bolt that was tape wrapped, and it was rubbing against the underside of the steel lid on the junction box, and the steel lid was not grounded. And these things were buried about 3 inches below the dirt. Well, it turns out that the little boy, when he was walking across barefoot, his right foot was a few inches off of the boundary of the junction box, and his left foot was over the junction box. So he got between current flow that did flow horizontally from the steel plate and then straight down into the ground. We hired engineering firms, and we pumped voltage all over those things, and we wet them down, and we tried to repeat the whole thing, and we could not find a current flow more than 7 inches away from the junction box. So he had to be within that little area. So that's the difference between the two. And in the discussion over the 80 standard, and you read these in preambles, they do recognize that, well, if you had a very high current source and you had an insulating layer of non-conductive earth, if the pathway was available outside of that insulating layer of earth, you might be able to force a current horizontally over that insulating barrier until it could get down into the earth if there was enough voltage pushing the current. So you can't say that it won't occur or that it can't, occur. Again, no absolutes, but they're going to be very, very, very narrow conditions that would create that kind of a hazard. But OSHA requires that we do address step potential around these trucks. So how do we decide? Because if you go back to some of the studies, like EPRI has done several studies, not all of them well organized, and we know that now. Some of them are 20 years old. And in one of them, they measure hazardous voltage like 42 feet away from Digger Derrick. Okay, so what? One of the things that you're going to see, and it doesn't matter who does the study, and I've read them all, none of the studies that are studying hazardous step potentials there are no tables involved that show the presence of hazardous current. So you can get shocked, but you're not likely to be killed by step potential. But that's not enough for a number of employers, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine if an employer wants to protect an employee against a step potential. But if I got an EPRI study that says hazardous step potentials measured 42 feet from a Digger Derrick energized at 7,200 volts, that's telling me that I've got to have some pretty long barriers out there, or everybody has to wear something like dielectric overshoes or insulating boots. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is that OSHA used to require that electrical workers wear insulating boots or electrical hazard boots until they realized that they can't justify that because those boots have no rating once they're taken out of the package. And if you read the manufacturer's information and if you read the ATSM standard on dielectric overshoes, the manufacturer has to produce a test of the design of the boot, but the very first paragraph in the owner's manual says that there is no test and no guarantee that of the electrical integrity of these boots once they are removed from the packaging. Mm-hmm. Because the boots can be contaminated. And if the boots are contaminated, then they're no good. Unlike our rubber gloves, our hot sticks, and our booms that are periodically electrically tested, there is no test for boots. Now, I could make one up. I could put an electrode inside the boot and fill it full of water, and I could dip it in, the same way that we test rubber gloves, but the boots aren't designed to be tested in that way. They're only designed for a sole of the boot that provides that protection. Mm-hmm. Now, I asked a guy who is on an ANSI, and I'm on ANSI, a couple of different ANSI committees, and a couple of SIGRE international committees, and I met the people in charge of the overshoe standard, and I said, why does it say that that the standard does not address in-use testing of overshoes? And he said, because when we were trying to create a standard that would address that, we were unsuccessful in finding consistent, repeatable results among the overshoes that were available in the market. And so OSHA took that requirement out, pretty quietly about 10 or 15 years ago, that removed the requirement that we have foot protection, dielectric foot protection. And if you go through the OSHA materials that you see now, you'll see that foot protection is mentioned as a last line of defense as part of a system of protection that requires equipotential matting, rubber gloves, barriers, barricades, and other things before they get to the last line of defense, which is the overshoes. Now, on top of that, we recently had another EPRI, and I got all kind of people involved in this because I said, this is the one we want to have. Because what they wanted to do was test the efficacy of overshoes and compare them to dielectric overshoes compared to electrical hazard work boots, and how you can protect yourself from these step potentials. Now, I can't tell you what the standard says because EPRI is a for-profit business. The studies that they do are sponsored by utilities who all pay a fee to be the owners of the final material. Now, you can get the material from EPRI, but you have to pay the sponsorship fee, which is about $15,000, or something like that. But I can tell you, since I do research for companies that were the sponsors, I have the report because it's part of the material that I need to help them build their programs. And so what we found out was that electrical hazard boots and dielectric overshoes provided the same level of protection for workers that use the barricade system to protect them away. And I'm adding some of these things in because, I mean, this whole thing is like 18 pages long, and I can't put it together right here for the purpose of this podcast. Right. But as part of a system of protection, those electrical hazard boots provided that level of protection up to about 3 feet away from the source. And the reason is because of the voltage collapse that is created when that voltage hits the ground. See, if I stick my Digger Derrick boom into a 7200 volt bus, and certainly if the truck is grounded, that's not 7200 volts coming down the boom, because that grounded pathway collapses the voltage, limiting the voltage rise that can occur. And then once it hits the resistance of the earth, it further limits that rise. Now, we mentioned earlier about the fact that current can't flow horizontally. Voltage can, because voltage only needs to be able to touch another conductive object to transfer an electrical charge. So if I have some conductivity in the earth, and if I put voltage in the ground at the outrigger, voltage is going to flow horizontally away from the outrigger, and it's going to drop as it moves away from the outrigger, and that's what creates that potential difference. But it's not the voltage on the outrigger or the voltage in the earth, it's the voltage between your feet. So if we train our personnel to recognize the nature of the step potential hazard, and we're wearing electrical safety work boots or dielectric overshoes, all of those are part of a system of protection for the worker. Now, here's what's going on with dielectric overshoes. We have a utility that's one of our clients, and I found out that they have a real live doctor working for them, and he was a research guy. And I said, oh, perfect. I talked them into doing stress tests on workers wearing rubber gloves. See, what we've known for years, and nobody has actually put metrics to it, is, and anybody that wears rubber gloves know, that if you squeeze a pair of clients enough time during the day in rubber gloves, your hands hurt. If you handle switch sticks or any kind of sticks in rubber gloves, your hands hurt. So the doctor is doing testing of grip loss in rubber gloves, and he's found out that this guarantees that if you wear your rubber gloves long enough, you're going to have carpal tunnel syndrome. He actually found 3 possible long-term soft tissue injuries created by the overuse of rubber gloves. Does that mean we're going to quit using them? No, we have to use them sometimes, but we don't have to use them all the time because there's an increase in the level of risk associated. This comes from the old standard that says every action has a consequence. Sometimes the consequence is good, but we also have to look at the bad consequences. Well, the next thing that he's going to look at is dielectric overshoes. I did research 20 years ago with dielectric overshoes by taking them to my podiatrist, the podiatric surgeon, and I showed him how we use them, what we use them for, and he just kind of grinned and chuckled. And he said, "I'll always have a trip to the Bahamas if you keep wearing these." Because he said
Yeah.
these things are going to give you lower back pain and they're going to damage your legs, if you wear them all day. And so we know that there are risks that are associated with that. But the last thing that I want to talk about here is how far away do we get, and what do we have to use? Well, in the OSHA equipment standard, not the 1910-269, but it's the equipment standard. OSHA has some rules about equipment maintaining a distance of 10 feet away from power line. And in that discussion, they talk about the need to ground a truck or not. And they also talk about making sure that if a truck is grounded, that employees on the ground near the truck maintain a distance away from the truck that would be affected by step potential if the truck should become inadvertently energized. And they say 3 to 5 feet in their recommendation. So OSHA has thought about it a little bit. You can't just, and OSHA has tried to say, well, that doesn't apply, but it does. And the question we always ask OSHA when they say, oh, you have to do this, and I said, we asked the question, or the lawyers asked the question of OSHA, how is it that you can tell an employer how he has to protect his employee? That's not what the rule says. And they always, agree that's the case. So we have an issue with grounding trucks. And if we ground trucks, we have to follow Rule P4 3C that requires us to do 4 different things unless we can show that the methods in use protect the worker. If I isolate that truck and I isolate employees away from that truck, then those employees are using part of a system of protection, such as electrical hazard boots. For instance, adding all of these methods together ensures that our employees are protected. And even though OSHA recognizes and insists that we recognize, you can talk to almost anybody in your work group, and you'll have people with 20 and 30 years of experience. You're not going to find any verifiable incidents where anybody was killed by step potential. That doesn't mean that it's not a risk because, like we said before, there are no absolutes. And I don't want anybody listening to the podcast say that, oh, the expert said that we don't have to do this and this. I'm not saying that. I'm telling you how the rules are to be applied and how we have defensible applications and what the requirements are, of that. There's nothing wrong with dielectric overshoes.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing wrong with putting out equipotential mats, around these trucks. But they all have consequences associated with them. And it's important that we understand what those consequences are so that we can appropriately apply the protections in the field for the protection of the worker.
Okay. Kind of in closing this out, Jim, like I have with the other episodes here, give us that one takeaway, right? Because grounding equipment might get the most conversation generated if you go out to a work group and throw the question into the center of the ring, right? All right, what are we going to do here? So what's that one key piece of advice to kind of level set everybody?
Well, it's 2-part. One of them is you as an employee must do whatever your employer has determined is necessary for your safety. There's no way around that. But you, as an expert, having been duly and properly informed of the hazards associated with the work, boils down to this. Grounding a truck alone does not ensure protection of anybody.
Mm-hmm.
Grounding trips the circuit, bonding protects the worker. Grounding a truck alone needs to be looked at again in light of Rule P4 3C. And if you're having struggles with that, you're listening to the podcast, don't feel bad. We deal with utilities every year on the level of probably a dozen or more each year who are rethinking their grounding policies, and we're helping them work their way through and develop practices or policies that meet the OSHA requirement and protect the worker.
Yep. Great advice. Okay. Questions, if you got them. podcast@ispconline.com. Send them in. We'll get them answered. We want to make sure we close the gaps here. If you need more information, ispconline.com. You can visit our website, check out the services we offer. You can reach out to myself, Mark, at ispconline.com. We can get you information on the services that ISPC offers. We can help you answer your questions. We can do all of the above.
IP Institute's Frontline program, empowering utility professionals to lead with confidence and safety. Visit ip-institute.com to start your journey today.
Before we jump into our closing here, Jim, I want to thank you immensely. This was a 5-episode podcast series that obviously we could not have done without your input. It's always great to sit and listen. And again, I think I've said it before, I always walk away with at least something, right? Every time you do this, you tend to get a little bit here and a little bit there. So again, thank you. Appreciate your time in doing this podcast, and I know it's near and dear to your heart. All of us that are kind of in the consulting world, are essentially looking to give back to our industry and make sure that the next generation coming through the pipeline hopefully has better information than we had to deal with. So
yeah, we want to make a difference. That's what we want to do.
That's right. Yep, couldn't have said it better. In closing, the views and opinions shared in this podcast are the personal viewpoints of the participants and may not necessarily reflect the stance of the Institute for Safety and Powerline Construction and its staff. It is highly advised to consult your company management before implementing any actions or policy changes. Please support the sponsors bringing you this content, and for more episodes of ISPC Tailboard Talks, you can subscribe in your favorite podcatcher and be sure to leave us a review. We'd love to hear from you. Again, questions, podcasts@ispconline.com. And until next time, for ISPC Tailboard Talks, I'm your host, Mark. Be safe out there, and if you're unsure, ask the question. Be safe. Thanks, everyone.